The title of the book is Seeking Redemption in an Unredeemed World. And it's an anthology of essays that were written by myself and a number of colleagues, many that are known to people in the Germantown Jewish Center community, and some have national reputations as well. And what we were looking at is how Judaism understands the whole idea of redemption, and are there ways in which we, in our everyday lives, spiritually, in terms of social justice, in terms of our relationships with each other, poetry, art, might be able to further the process of Geulah in the world. There's a story that's told about a youth group that was going to do a chesed program, and they were going to do a visit to a senior adult living facility. And the kids were walking through, and they saw an elderly Jewish woman over her prayer book and very piously reciting her techina, reciting the specific prayers that had been written in Yiddish for women. And the kids had never seen anything like this. They were high school juniors and seniors. And so one boy says to the girl next to him, he goes, like, what do you think she's doing? And she says, well, it's pretty clear. She's studying for her finals. And when I heard the story, I thought that not only was it cute, but it indeed had some really important existential meaning, because of the fact that particularly now, as they've done more study in terms of people moving towards the end of their lives, but even the rest of us now, as we approach Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we try our mortality on for size, the question is, what queries should we be looking at in terms of our own lives? If we're going to cram for our finals, what might be the questions on those final exams? So interestingly enough, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, there's a statement by Rava, and it says that when one leaves this world, one's life will be assessed by the Heavenly Tribunal. And they're going to ask you a number of questions. Among them were nasata v'natata be'emunah, right? Did you do business faithfully, right? Were you honest in business? Or did you also enter into give and take over matters of faith? Asakta b'privya v'rivya, not only a question of did you physically bring children into the world, but have you been generative in terms of mentoring others, in terms of providing new opportunities and new vistas for people? Kivita itim la Torah, did you set time for Torah, or did you establish your schedule in a way in which we find the values of Torah mirrored? Like, what are your priorities in terms of how you schedule your time? And so one of the questions that's going to be asked on the Heavenly Final is the question of Tzipita liyeshua. Did you glimpse salvation? Now, the word Tzipita is interesting because it's not, as you find in some translations, did you await salvation? Did you look for salvation? Literally, the word sopheh means a scout. So if we wanted to translate this literally, it was, were you on the lookout? Did you scout out moments of salvation? And this seems to be a question that is essential to the entire Jewish enterprise. Franz Rosenzweig, who was a very well-known Jewish philosopher in Germany about a century ago, wrote a book entitled The Star of Redemption. And he says that Judaism rests on three pillars: creation, revelation, and redemption, and that each of these cross-pollinate each other and relate to each other. So if one thinks about the liturgy of the high holy days into which we're entering, and some of the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah, it says, Tekai shofar gadol lecherutenu, sound the great shofar for our freedom. And in the shofrot service on the Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, it talks about the shofar being sounded at the time of creation, the Torah being given amidst the sound of the shofar, and at the end of time, the shofar will announce the coming of the final messianic age. And so interestingly enough, that while all three of these pillars of Judaism's view of time interact with each other and partake of each other, through creation, God saves the world from chaos. Through revelation, that we find redemption from having to make everything up by ourselves. We find redemption through guidance. That probably the most important pillar is redemption, is geula. There are 4 different Hebrew words that denote redemption. And interestingly, each of these are taken from a human activity and are only metaphorically applied to God. So when I was thinking about organizing the essays around this question of redemption, and I don't think any of us question that we're living in an unredeemed time, what does Judaism have to say about, redemption and redemptive activities? So there are 4 Hebrew words that speak the language of redemption, and each of them actually has a little bit different connotation. One of those words is Yeshua, the word we usually translate as salvation. And this refers to spaciousness, living with abundance, not being confined on any side. That's why the Hebrew word for trouble is sarat, surus, right? Because when you're in surus, you're hemmed in on all sides by like circumstances with no options or avenues for escape. And so when we look to God as Moshiach, as the Redeemer, we're asking God to empower us to help us liberate ourselves from external and internal forces that constrain us. A second word, pidyon, which sometimes is translated as ransom, also indicates release and restoration. And that's usually when goods or money were exchanged in order to restore people or creatures or objects to their original status. And I think many of us have attended the ceremony of Pidyon Haben. If a baby boy is born, is firstborn, and in the Torah, the firstborn were initially the ones to serve God in the temple, and that this son is not descended on father or mother's side from a Kohen or Levi family, then on the 31st day, there is a ceremony called Pidyon Haben, where you give certain coins to a Kohen, and you're able to redeem your son and then take him back so he can serve God through everyday life as opposed to the duties of the priesthood. Many of us know also that Pidyon Shvuim, the redemption of captives, is perhaps one of the most important of the mitzvot that we find in Judaism. If someone is taken captive and communities will collect money for us, in our time, Soviet Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry were among the large communal instances of Pidyon Shvuim in which we participated. And then the final 2 words, Hatzalah, deliverance, literally means to snatch away, to rescue people, creatures, or objects from threatening situations. That the return community from Babylonia was referred to by the prophets as Ud Mutzal Me'esh, like a brand that was plucked out of the fire. And that when we return to God as Hamatzil, the deliverer, that God can help empower us to help in our own rescue for physical danger, sin, or death. And finally, the last word is Geula, which we interpret as redemption, and that actually is taken from the language of kinship responsibility. That individuals have responsibilities in their tribe and family group to maintain the integrity of the clan. So that if someone in your group, for example, got in debt, that you were expected to step forward to help relieve their debt so that they wouldn't find family property going to an outside buyer. In addition to that, we also find the case, for example, in the book of Ruth, where Boaz acts as the goel. When a couple would be childless and the husband would die, so the wife would be widowed, and they had no children, then it was, in the Torah says a brother, but as we see, it can also be a cousin, can step in, marry the widow, and then the first child that that couple has is considered to be the child of the deceased husband, the deceased brother or cousin, and inherits the late husband's property, right? Is considered fully that person's heir. So Boaz is referred to in the book of Ruth as the goel, right? And Naomi says, he's our redeeming kinsman. It's like we're not stuck out here all by ourselves. And I think particularly of import in this time, when we see how people who are refugees are being treated when they're met at our borders and thrown into cages and that, what's interesting to note is that the Hebrew term ger, which we use for an alien or stranger, literally meant someone who lived among people who were not their kin, so that there would be no goalim, no one who would be able to stand up to champion their cause as redeeming kinsmen. The definition of a ger is someone who has no goel, no champion, no family member who's going to step forward in order to save them, avenge their wrongs. And so therefore God tells the Israelites, basically, since the Egyptians treat you as gerim, that I, God, will be your goel. So that when we have at the end of the prayer, Michamocha, Baruch atah Hashem Ga'al Yisrael, blessed are you, God, who is Redeemer of Israel, and that's what they're referring to. The Israelites had no goel, and therefore God steps in to be our divine goel, and calls us to be goalim for those who have no one to stand up for them, the weak, the dispossessed, the alien, and those who find themselves in harrowing situations. One of the things that's very interesting is that Judaism has a very different view of redemption than other traditions. Other traditions, for example, or there are other traditions that look at redemption as being redemption from history. Redemption from history. So, for example, in the Gospel according to Luke, it says that, God sent the community Jesus who will redeem us from this terrible history. The Eastern traditions, Taoism, Jainism, Hinduism, Buddhism, all look at the idea that what one wants to do is escape the cycle of history of samsara and find some kind of ultimate release. And they each have different technologies and different theories and philosophies in terms of how one does this. Whereas in Judaism, not only do we metaphorically apply human acts of redemption to God, human redeeming acts, we ascribe them to God, but in addition to that, we also celebrate partial redemptions. So I know we haven't gotten to Rosh Hashanah yet, but if one thinks about Hanukkah, Hanukkah is a fascinating holiday because the Maccabees are able to gain independence from the Seleucid Greeks, from the Syrian, Hellenistic Syrians, and around the year 163 before the Common Era. That's when they're able to retake the temple. Judean independence lasts only another 100 years until Pompey Magnus from Rome comes to the gates of Jerusalem. The two contenders for the throne, one of them his supporters throws the gates open to him, and that's the end of Jewish independence until 1948. And yet, even though the redemption lasted, the Maccabean redemption only lasted 100 years, we still celebrate Hanukkah every year. And we still look at the miracle of the light and the pushing away of the darkness. And so the permanence of the redemption is not the measure in terms of whether we've experienced Geula, whether we've experienced some type of salvation, right? Redemption takes place in time, and we celebrate partial redemptions. And so the essays in this book, the way that I was looking at it in terms of organizing it and soliciting articles was in terms of what are the practices, spiritual practices, artistic practices, and also practices of social justice that will allow us to glimpse and to further redemption, multiply at least partial redemption in our historical world. So I'm in advance of Rosh Hashanah, I'm going to share with you selections from 3 of those articles, okay, that have practical application and practices right, that you can include in your preparation for the Yamim Noraim, and also that can help us, right, during our own observances of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So one of those is someone who was written by someone who I know fairly well, my wife, Bobby Brightman, who is a Jewish spiritual director, perhaps the mother of Jewish spiritual guidance in the United States, in North America, in the liberal community, and also is a longtime practicing therapist. And her article appears early in the book, in the section dealing with Yeshua, expanding past boundaries. And in this particular article, she picks up on an idea that Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan articulated decades ago, which is the notion of God not as a personality and not as some type of divine entity towards which one could point, but rather looking at God as a process, what she calls the process of becoming. She talks about the practice of discernment is a holy habit of listening into our lives with awareness, with kavanah, the intention to hear how the holy is calling through our bodies, our inner lives, through other people, through work and play, through relationships and experience. Calls can come from tradition and history, from our communities and current events, in our nation and around the world, from the earth herself, and even from non-human creatures. As the heavenly retinue calls to one another, Melochol ha'aretz kavodo, that indeed the whole world is infused with the presence. Perhaps the most well-known text in Torah, when God shares something directly with a human being about the nature of the divine, is the story of the burning bush, hence the burning bush to the left. Moses asks God's name and is told, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, I will be that which I will be. The holiest name of God in Torah refers not to an entity, not even a divine entity, but rather to the process of becoming. That if one looks in all of Tanakh, that God is often calling people into the future. God is calling Abraham, Lech lecha, go out from the place that you're at and go out to the land that I will show you in a new future. God calls to Hagar in the wilderness when she has been thrown out of her home with Abraham and fears that her child Ishmael is going to die. And the angel calls Hagar, Hagar, right? And it says that, strengthen your hand by nurturing your son, for he will, your descendants will be a great people. Moses, Jacob, right? They're all called, Isaiah, all called into the future. And so therefore, in her essay, one of the practices that Bobby offers that I think is be very helpful, right? And I'm going to ask you actually, as I'm reading it, that if you feel comfortable, kind of close your eyes or just look softly ahead, right? If you can, slow your breathing a little and listen into your life and allow the words, the arc of your becoming, to echo inside the arc of your becoming. Notice what arises. What are the edges of your becoming at this moment in your life? What is being born and what might be dying or coming to an end? What new opportunities, new relationships are presenting themselves, and what things seem to be tapering off? What is emerging and what might you need to let go of? What may be pressing for expression, calling for attention, asking you from beyond yourself? And perhaps what risks, challenges, situations are presenting themselves that could be opportunities to grow or change in life-giving ways? How are you being called into the unknown, into service to follow what is holy. So I'm going to leave this up and invite you to just take this in for a few moments. And if you want to make some notes to yourself in terms of what's being born, what's coming to an end, what's emerging, what do you need to surrender, right? How are you being called beyond yourself, particularly in this pressing moment? Risks, challenges, opportunities to grow or change in life-giving ways, being called into service. Take a few moments, and if you like, make yourself a couple of notes. And they might be helpful in terms of, offering guidance during this month of Elul, and during the Cheshbon HaNefesh, the accounting of our souls that we do during the Yamim Noraim, right? To kind of help free us from the boundaries of, the everyday grind, and that we think that what it was has to be, right? Give us some Yeshua in this case, some opening up, what needs to be taken with and what do we need to let go. In the Geula section, the section that deals with needing to be redeeming kin, both for other human beings, for other creatures, for the earth. About 3 years ago, Arthur Wasco, who really is the caption under the phrase Mayan Mitgaber, an overflowing well that even now moving into his late 80s, still is a fountain of creativity. He was teaching a course at a Jewish renewal summer retreat program called Ruach HaAretz about 3 years ago, and came up with this practice, which he calls praying with trees. It's in his article called The Shofar in the White House. And what this article points out is that it's several times in Jewish history, Rosh Hashanah has been used as the occasion to mark social transitions within Jewish life, both after the return from Babylonia, and we find it in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the Yom Truah, the day of the blowing of the shofar, is first spoken of in a way that we might recognize as Rosh Hashanah. And then later, after the destruction of the Second Temple, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and his fellow scholars went to Kerem B'Yavne and set up a rabbinic court and also set up an academy there, very, very soon after the destruction, Rosh Hashanah fell on Shabbat. And up until that time, the shofar had only been blown in the temple on Rosh Hashanah if it occurred on Shabbat. And so they were like, well, what should we do? And so they said, well, we've got to study the matter. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, Rosh Hashanah is a couple days away. We won't have time to do it. Let's blow this year. And then afterwards, we'll study it. So they blew, and then afterwards, a group of scholars, the B'nai B'Teira, came to and said, okay, time to study the issue. Said, no, we have a precedent. Now we blow the shofar on Shabbat wherever there's an academy. And so what he did, in effect, was transfer the power of the priesthood to Torah scholars, the temple to the yeshiva, its authority. So that in our time, when we're seeing so much environmental destruction taking place, that Arthur came up with this idea, which he calls praying with trees. Some of us are acquainted in Martin Buber's I and Thou, where it talks about him communing with the tree, and standing and entering into, a subject-to-subject relationship with the tree. Arthur actually takes it further. He ritualizes it. And he says that, one should go in front of a tree, right? And one should pray and then listen through the rustling of the branches and what arises within one's own consciousness what might be the prayer of the tree on this Rosh Hashanah? And given the fact that we're, still pretty much in quarantine and we're not going to be able to be in our synagogues for the most part on Rosh Hashanah, so we can be together on Zoom, but we don't have to quarantine from our trees, right? You can go into the yard, you can go, out into the park, right? And so he set this kavanah, which is on the left side of the bark. We're about to enter Amidah, where we take our stance in the breath of life, murmuring prayer with our own breathing. The exchange of CO2 and oxygen between trees, grasses, and humans and other animals is what keeps life alive on planet Earth. For this breathing Amidah, we invite you to stand near a tree and breathe together and hear the tree's Amidah, the tree's standing prayer of silent devotion, and listen to what the tree is saying, what the tree is praying. And they have a selection from Rabbi Chana Tiferet Siegel's version of Eitz Chaim. It's a tree of life. And he did this with about 20-some people at this retreat. And on the right-hand side, up by the green, you can actually see, right, the responses that people had in terms of what did they hear, what was sparked in them listening to the tree. So we'll just read one. The tree I befriended had prickly pine needles, and I could hear it saying to me, you who breathe me in and out, I'm breathing out to you. The prickly scent, just like my prickly needles. A prickly scent to say to you, wake up. A scent of more than sleep. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, breathe with me. I may be in danger, but my prickly needles, my prickly scent, I'm sending to awaken you. So literally this pine tree, right, was calling out to this worshiper like a shofar. And then there's the voice of a woman who heard her son's voice coming through the canopy of the tree and the branches. And so for those of us, who might be taking a walk on Rosh Hashanah, might be wanting to go to do an individual tashlich, might be also a possibility to also spend some time with Arthur's practice of praying with trees. And I'm going to leave you with what Herb Levine calls new Psalms for a new paradigm. These are two poems that he wrote. And what Herb has been doing over these last several years is kind of trying to lift up the natural spirituality stream that was found like in kibbutz Judaism, that's found in Achad Ha'am, some of the early cultural Zionists, which is a spirituality that doesn't speak of God, definitely not a personal God, but rather of looking at life with a capital L, right? And praising life and finding the wonder that is there that also calls us to a sense of awe and gratitude. And so here's two of Herbie's poems. Every Rosh Hashanah during my childhood, my father would ask Bubba, why are the corners of your prayer books folded over, like prayer books pages folded over? And every year she answered him, this is where we cry. From her life of wandering, my Bubba understood tears and what follows from them. In no way challenge fate by failing to mention the one who watches over all, but hope with the help of God, be grateful with praise of God, and thank God. I also want to express hopes and give thanks for the good in my life and be amazed by the wonders of the universe. With the help of the world, my tongue is getting used to new expressions. And then one for Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of creation. We have this little Mother Earth world ocean at the bottom. My life and yours began through a crack in the ocean floor, through which heat rose and still rises. From the core of the earth, catalyzed the salty waters. The amino acids were created, containing the history of life in the sea, on land, in the air. The psalmists sing, with you as the source of life. Every day I too acknowledge the source of life that still enlivens my breath. From Einstein and his students, I learned that the elements in me were forged in the same furnace as the stars. From other great ones, I learned I sit, breathe, pay attention with watchful eyes to a world filled with glory and wonders, like me, like you. and like the stars. And herb selection appears in the Pidyon section in terms of restoration and release, because there are many of us for whom the classical images and language of Judaism and theistic Judaism of, a personal God, no matter how that personal God is envisioned, the one who commands, and that it speaks to many and it doesn't speak to others. And that's why Herb called this, new Psalms for a paradigm shift. As I had mentioned, Judaism seems to emphasize redemption within history, even when those redemptions are partial and fleeting. And these words are taken from my introductory essay called In Celebration of Partial Redemptions. And may this volume provide multiple openings through which the spirit of redemption may be glimpsed, welcomed, and then pursued. And we have the openings where the light comes in. Let me again thank Ed and Dick and the members of the Men's Club. Let me thank everybody who's joined. And may the light of redemption shine upon all of us during these coming weeks and months, because God knows we can certainly use light amidst too much darkness that's been going on. So God bless and thank you from the bottom of my heart.